Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this week's Lunch and Learn. I'm Tony Ross, Director of Communications at Provalis Research. The presentation today is by John Aaron. Just before we get to it, I want to tell you about our next event, which is taking place on March 29th at the same time, 12 p.m. Eastern. The title is No Comment Left Behind, the use of computer-assisted coding in large data sets. The host will be Lucy McIntosh. Lucy is a senior research assistant at the University of Hertfordshire. Lucy has a background in psychology, studying both for her master's and her undergraduate degree at Hertfordshire. Predominantly, Lucy's research focuses on patient experience of kidney care and analyzing patient-free text comments in response to the kidney patient reported experience measure. Lucy will show us the analysis of a national survey using QDA Miner, analyzing more than 7,000 comments using coding techniques such as text retrieval, cluster extraction, and grid method. The presentation of these codes uses frequency analysis, code occurrence variables, presenting the data in tables, graphs, and figures. You can register for this session, which again is March 29th, on the webinar section of the Provalis Research website. Now to today's presentation, which is titling Uncovering Propaganda, Deception, and Bias in Media Reporting, Using Text Analytics as a Scientific Tool for Automatic Detection, Part 2. Dr. John Aaron is hosting this event. John is a PhD, Economics and PMP. He's a 26-year veteran of project management and a data science consultant. This is the second event in a three-part series. If you missed the first one, don't worry. And you can also go back and watch a recording on the webinar section of our website. Session 2 explores examples of uncovering linguistics patterns of deception in text using a combination of text analytics and statistical analysis. I'll dispense with a long intro since John will explain it much better than I. We will take questions at the end of the presentation. Please ask your questions through the chat feature. I will select them and read them to the group. Now over to John.
Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning, or good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to session 2, and what we'll do is we'll kind of advance. So when you signed up, you kind of saw this describing it, and we are kind of continuing a story of dealing with propaganda, deception, and bias involving text analytics. And it can be more than text. It can be visuals, it can be pictures, and so on. But we're going to try and restrict this to that. So essentially, I'm assuming you kind of read the introduction. So basically, what we're going to do this period is we're going to do a very, very quick recap of session 1. Tony indicated that if you missed it, you can go back. I got a little bit more heavier into the statistical analysis there, but I'm going to be covering much of it again. And today we're going to talking about censorship and some of its subtleties, and also linguistics and using text to uncover some of these. And also deploying automation. I'm going to be showing an example of that. My colleague, Dale Van Leeuwen, and I, we put together deploying a model that involves kind of connecting WordStat, the output of WordStat, to Minitab text, basically a predictive analytics module, and showing how it deploys on the web. Because that's kind of where we're heading. If we're going to be talking about automation, how do you do this? And both of those tools work very, very well together, complementary together, and we'll show you some of that. But most of it is going to be dealing with the actual analysis of text itself. And then also, last time when we met, we had a discussion on framing, preemptive framing, and so I did a little bit of continued work on that, and I'd like to visit that towards the end. So that's in a nutshell. So if I look at the highlights or lowlights, whatever you want to say, of what we covered last time, we covered the Janis and Mann conflict theory model, psychological model that was identified in their book in 1977. And it talked about driving people to vigilant decision-making. And what I want to stress is that that is really the underlying goal of all of this. Now, when you review the literature on propaganda and all this, it almost always points to the role of the state or governments in doing this. And so for me, it's not one side or another, state versus non-state. It's the individual making vigilant decisions that are likely to produce good results for that person, and how you spot this and how you can use tools to do that. And so I always anchor everything kind of in that kind of a framework. Now, what we did last time is we looked at sequential data, and I talked a lot about daily posts, either on browser searches or in social media, in that you can get patterns, especially with that. And we talked about using those to test hypotheses. So we spoke quite some theories, and we talked about those from the political left, from the political right, kind of the center. Noam Chomsky, Yost Mirlu, Jacques Ellul. I didn't really talk much about him, but he's a part of this too, and Michael Flynn. And so they kind of came together in terms of providing theory that's needed for testing. So if we follow a scientific method, such as produced by Karl Popper, espoused by his logic of scientific discovery, it starts with the theory. And then it basically looks at these and then it tests those. And what we talked about was being able to test these kinds of things with a reference. So taking examples of something we have trust in versus something we have questions of, and then looking at distributions of data, of word data, and seeing how they match, and looking at, for instance, likelihood ratios, which is an older Bayesian method, or what we can use are some of the more predictive modeling machine learning methods. And this time I'm going to be kind of steering us away from the older methods, more to the newer ones, but we had to have a background in likelihood ratios. So if you go back and you look at the previous one, you'll see I covered that quite a bit, and I'm going to continue today. And also what's really important is topic modeling. And the ability, and this is a very, very important capability of WordStat, to do this kind of thing, to be able to take phrases, topics, and not just look at individual words, but to be able to group these kinds of things in the way, and the tool is very, very powerful for that. And it lends itself to its own internal modeling, as well as exporting very easily to other tools. And I use Minitab as an example of that. So basically, if we continue kind of recapping, what we did is I showed last time a bit about this, taking these different topics coming out of daily news reports. I continue to do that. I take samples daily of titles, and I look at all these kinds of things, and we kind of match these to theories. And if we follow, for instance, Chomsky and others, the underlying goal of propaganda is basically, one, to generate fear, because that's how things kind of work. It gets people's attention and it takes them off a rational course of action. And then it secures them to consent to some other course of action that they usually do unto themselves, right, to ourselves. And so that was kind of one of the things we tested, some of these types of things, and looked at it. And if we also kind of take a look at topic modeling, and for instance, we tie these theories together into some sort of a cohesive whole, where does all this lead? Well, it's you know, this is really from one channel or one site where I consolidated theories. Each one of these items that could deal with digitalization, psychological operations, the involvement of Defense Department, Michael Flynn on that, PSYOPs, Flynn, Chomsky, dealing with the executive branch and government, elections, which is Chomsky, going all the way down. All of these are items that can be theories, but they require some form of testing and putting kind of a cohesive whole into that. And so each of those elements, conceivably, there can be aspects of deception, propaganda, untruths, things of that nature. So it becomes a point of saying, all right, how do we test and operationalize these things? And it almost always gets back. The fact is, we can be misled by any side. So you'll see from me that I'm a very, very neutral kind of presenter, a person, in that I don't go necessarily any side, left, right, or whatever. The only goal is to get people to vigilant decision-making, and then using information and how to spot things that basically take us on a path. If you view Janus and Mann, essentially it starts out with stressful, threatful information, that then is led with information that steers us towards channels that are suboptimal, But when we continue to probe and ask information and search and takes those things, that leads us to what a path that they call vigilance. And so that's the way we kind of structure this whole thing. We don't take political sides or ideological sides. Rather, we take the side of what is in a person's self-interest and getting information that is valid and spotting things that are not necessarily valid, right? So we talked about that. And so that's the goal of vigilant decision-making. And so what we also talked about was that with propaganda, usually typically starts with a challenging threat or negative feedback, and then you get information that basically short circuits a rational kind of process towards decision-making. And what it does, it takes advantage of certain vulnerabilities that we as humans have. So if you look at, for instance, the last presentation, I did include with the slides a bibliography that's pretty extensive that kind of talks about some of these types of things, that what it does on the rational side of humans, of us as man, we can be intellectual, realist, individual, few things are rational, scientific, but we have the capability of being brought to the other side, right? And that's where the fear part comes in, and that's where information to steer us things, that's where that kind of comes in. So all this is recap essentially, you know, of what we talked about last time. So what Janice and Mann said was that the way to avoid this, of course, is first recognize what's happening to you, but insist on making sure that whenever you have a choice, that you canvass all sorts of alternatives. You keep an open mind. You basically assess the plus and minuses and risks of taking different courses of action. You search for relevant information. You challenge initial choices, and you re-examine before you make a final choice, and you develop some form of contingency planning. And so this is the goal, so to speak, of what we're trying to do. So the question is, how do we spot things that maybe are causing us to short circuit this? What are some of the common techniques? And so our goal really is foster vigilant decision making. That's our primary objective. And what we talked about last time, was that we explored and did hypothesis testing following the Popper kind of framework. Was fear and anxiety generation was one thing we looked at over here. If I kind of look at that, polarization, we looked at that, demonization, and we tested hypotheses. And what we're going to be dealing with today is how censorship kind of works. It's more subtle, I think, than just blocking information, but it's clearly there. Equivocation through euphemisms, which is very, very sophisticated, and it really, I think, tests the limits of text analytics quite a bit. And then also I'm going to start to lead into this idea of a computer-generated text. And we're going to be viewing some of that, but I view session 3 is really get into it when we get into more sophisticated kinds of methods on how we spot that, okay? So that's kind of where we're headed. So we're going to have this continuation of where we started, where we left off, and we're going to kind of follow that through. And then there'll be many, many other methods that we probably will not get to in these things, but you should have the tools to be able to find these things, what they are, and be able to do your own testing. And that's the goal, is to give you've got a very, very powerful set of tools available to you. And the ability to do this and model this is all there. It's really up to you. So we went through those, and we'll start our new information right now. So essentially, I laid out propositions, kind of starting points that where to begin with. And today we're going to start with this idea of censorship. And again, I'm not just talking about current times. I have looked at historical is to the extent I can. Obviously, it's hard to mine text going way back, but you can, looking at Hitler's speeches and Goebbels and people like that. You can get some of those kinds of things. But the idea here is that censorship is the backbone of propaganda. It involves more than just blocking information in a general way. It includes selectiveness in the promotion of specific ideas, as well as creating murkiness in ideas to the cause of the propagandists. Typically, successful propaganda requires censorship, and and it usually recommends to some sort of a document of official truth, right? That is put on there. And historically, these kinds of documents might have been things like Mein Kampf, which was Hitler's, the Communist Manifesto, which different socialist regimes espoused. And today we're going to look at a subsect, a subcomponent of what we would see from the government today in the United States, which I'm going to use as the CDC, the Center for Disease Control. Now, because I can have some experience with this, and also it's a very, very illustrative example where I have a lot of data, okay? As a consultant, as well as a teacher, as a professor in data science with my students. So if I start with the CDC, and I'll kind of build this out as this kind of single source of truth, and how we can use this as a vehicle to start testing hypotheses for or against a certain course of action. The CDC, Center for Disease Control, very much endorsed things like lockdowns. It gave daily death rate reports, PCR tests, for this is dealing with COVID, pandemic models, mass vaccines, and the like. And personally, I was very much involved. I started out very much against any of the lockdowns because I'm an economist. And I put out webinars on my own, tried to with city managers saying, look, there's a thing called the Preston curve that says that if you shut down an economy, your death rates are going to increase. And so basically my message to them was you have to thread a needle. But I didn't get very far with that in terms of people receiving that idea. And also I did use and believed in very much the CDC's numbers for death rate reports. And I had all my students using this. I used these as a consultant to help companies decide which offices they could open and which they couldn't by county data and so on. And so I really was very much involved in using their data and truly believed a lot of these kinds of things. And in fact, I gave a webinar a year ago for Provalis Research, December 9, 2021, on the subject of whether or not to take the COVID vaccine. There were pros and cons, and I anchored this in the Janus and Mann framework, and I took a very neutral position. And again, I don't endorse any decision to take something or not to take it. I just want to endorse vigilant decision-making, again, and that was the goal of that, and we talked about it. But I uncovered a lot of data, and we did text mining, we did topic modeling, and I was able to come up with data that was dealing with both the pros and the cons with this. But a very interesting thing occurred, and this is where I'm aiming. I'm not taking shots at the CDC as much as I am on some interesting occurrences. So if I look at the data set that I used, there was about almost 400 documents, and when I deleted them for duplicates, it came out to about 400. Now look at this carefully. If you look at this idea on endorsing, recommending taking the vaccine, when I looked at just browser searches, it was highly recommended to take the vaccine, right? If you look at endorsements as in WordStat as rates per 10,000 words, you can see it shoots out here. You also see what an important metric this is in WordStat. In order to fulfill the requirement of Janus and Mann, and that is look at the pros and cons, I was forced to go into social media. And you'll see that the endorsements are far less there, right? So what was happening, it became pretty clear to me at the time, both for my students and as a consultant for business on whether or not they should open up on these lockdowns. You see that there is a definite distinction between certain social media platforms and also what you would find in general from just doing browser searches. And I looked at Google, Firefox, almost all of them I could think of. And now here is the other thing that's of useful importance. And that is if you look at the those on the browser side, what you see is a correlation coefficient. So if I look at those items that came from, not from social media, but from the browser, you see these Pearson R correlation coefficients, essentially 0.8, 0.7, 0.8, 0.8, 0.8. These are phrases that I mined using WordStat and looked and correlated those with a dictionary that I built on CDC phrases, okay? So basically, if you look at the social media, you'll get some occasional high ones, but mostly they're not really significantly correlated. But if you look at those that came from here, the words are very much taken from there. Now, part of my reason for stressing this is that when we start talking about conceivably in detail next session about computer generated text, you see the ability to leverage a single document and then just generate a computer profile of generating text tied to that single document. That's where there's a potential problem, right? So it's these high correlation coefficients to a single source of truth. So if I move on and not worry about just medical stuff, but let's say we were in Germany in 1940 or the late 1930s, chances are there would be media that would be going on speaking about Mein Kampf, right? Or that would have the same kind of pattern of a high correlation to this kind of single source of truth. Yet that is so contradictory to one, Janice and Mann saying, how do you make good decisions? And basically to science saying where you do good hypothesis testing, right? That where if you follow Karl Popper, which I talked quite a bit about last time, where you tend to argue back and forth and bicker back and forth over items to unveil the truth, right? So this whole single source of truth thing is an item for you to look at. It doesn't have to be CDC, it can be anything. But whenever you see that kind of thing, that's telling you that it is one, anti-science, and two, probably not in your best interest, right? In terms of making decisions. So here's an example of how I built a dictionary from the CDC website. I updated it again from last year. And you see that there are certain key words that are coming out of here that you can use for correlation. So what you do when you're dealing with WordStat is that you import your documents, right? And each of those documents can have a field of its own. You can add to it, but also when you do topic modeling, you can, for instance, export each of those topics and look at the words, the mentions of those items under there. And then what you can do is you can flip it, kind of like a matrix, and then just use the documents as a variable, and then come up with the correlation coefficients from there, right? So you got a lot of flexibility with WordStat, especially if you export some of these things, and you can then do that. And then from there, right, what you can do is you can set a label and says, look, if the correlation is very high, it means likely that they recommended or not. So basically, when I take that document and try to follow this, it might be a little bit convoluted, but I use the Minitab CART classification and regression tree, really Jerry Friedman, Leo Breiman type of algorithm that they use. And then I said that, look, if I go back and I say, look, it's very, very likely they have recommended taking the COVID vaccine, if in fact it has a high correlation with the CDC because they strongly recommend it in the CDC, I can use that as a predictor, right, to say whether or not it is recommended or not, right? And I can kind of consider that in my own personal decisions. Now, I'm not saying CDC is wrong. I'm just saying that if you kind of set these linkages, that there's kind of all these documents and all these sites that are just parroting what one site is saying, that is probably not a good thing, right? And so you want to continue to search for additional information. So if we take it further, because what our objective is to be able to build models that spot potential risks of deception, of bias, of propaganda. Well, what you see is that these key phrases, these key words that we come up with in WordStat, and the correlation with the number of either the mentions or the mentions per 10,000, they become very strong predictors, and you end up with some very solid models. So in this case, I took the Minitab, and you can see in just a few phrases, you can come up with very, very strong predictors here. So for instance, we came up with 83% correct for recommending, and then 97% for not recommending. And you kind of get these statistics of positive rates, true positive rates, true negative rates. It does its own internal testing, which is very, very helpful. So what that allows you to do then is to take any other document, any other, could be a browser search, it could be a web posting, and then compare that to this model, because now we have identified certain specific phrases and terms that are tied to one way or another, right? So that's one way of doing it. So here, looking at the Minitab type of thing, you see this receiving operating curve. It shows it's a good model. And then you can see here the correlation with the CDC. It's showing as that goes up, the recommendation probability goes high. If people are saying the shots are dangerous, then it goes down. If some people talk about medical tyranny and so on like that, then it goes down. So you see there's the pros and the cons, and where the particular posting, be it a browser search or a social media posting, that gives you insights that allows you to predict. So for instance, with just five words, it could be the correlation with the CDC, how close it tied to that, whether or not the person talked about it being dangerous, if there was negative words in the sentiment dictionary of Provalis. That's a very, very important item we talked about last time, the positives and negatives. It's a very, very robust document, the Provalis sentiment dictionary. And then you positive words and negative words. From those, we can then make these kinds of predictions and classifications. And so a classification becomes a flag that says, wait a minute, there's a good chance there might be something wrong with this, right? Now, let me comment too that one of the important things in understanding when you're doing prediction on these is that different people tend to use slightly different words, right? So the better the model you can create with as few words as possible and still come up with a good prediction is very, very important. And WordStat has a machine learning tool that's basically a naive Bayes model. It does work well. It doesn't do quite as well in terms of getting just the fewest possible words. And that's why I'm using the Minitab tool. And Minitab for machine learning is my general tool that I use for this. So now, why is John Aaron talking about the CDC? Well, very quickly, again, I'm not going against anybody particularly. I'm just promoting vigilant decision making. But what I did is when I was both a consultant and a teacher, I had all my students, my graduate students, basically taking command centers to say which counties could be open, which couldn't, to give them a good practical experience. Well, I used the CDC data, and they produced these daily death rates, if you may recall. The problem is, in the first quarter of 2020, they retracted all these things, okay? They sent out a provisional report that basically, when I looked at it in using it, all the correlations went away, right? And so I lost a great amount of confidence in that. And when people still start using that as the single source of the truth, so to speak, I question it. And that's my rationale for that type of thing. So these are the kind of things that I leveraged and used, and this is why I chose them for this example. Now, where I'm going with this too is the danger, and we're going to talk about this more for those of you that want to hear about this in the third session, is when you start talking about text generation itself, and you go to sites that say, okay, write a report for me about should I get the COVID vaccination? And it spits out something that is totally tied almost verbatim to the CDC. You see the potential risk here, and it's what Mike Flynn called see a cat, paint a tiger. And that is, it could be just a very, very small number of people really endorsing a cause. But if you can generate enough websites and computer generated text, it appears that there's this massive movement going on to promote a particular cause, right, of some type. And so it has a real potential there. And so what we're going to be talking about next time is a lot of using I'm going to be using LSTMs in the background and generating text and see if there's ways to spot computer generated text in general. So that's one of my projects that I work on that. And so what I've done is I kind of continued along this line more recently, not just using the data from my last year's where I gave this group, but to this day, it continues that this relationship between what you find in browser searches is very, very highly correlated to the CDC document. And more importantly, perhaps, you see high correlations between browser searches, right? Like 0.82, meaning everybody is saying the same thing, right? And so we're not getting, when we do that, when we settle for that, we are not following what I'll call Janice and Mann's vigilant decision-making kind of a thing. So what is the alternative? The alternative is to keep searching for more information until you find conflicting disagreements where you get the issues coming out of things, right? That is what science would promote. That is what vigilant decision-making would promote. And the danger is that if people are generating bots and AI on these things, you're getting basically maybe one person generating, who knows, hundreds of different sites or channels in social media, right? So that's the thing to kind of look out for. Now, what I'm going to talk about next session is all the work that's going on in generating text generation. A lot of things like LSTMs, long short-term memory, deep learning, all these things are going on by very reputable and notable institutions. And so that's kind of going on in the background. Okay, so enough said on that topic about censorship and its subtleties, so to speak. The next thing is a concept, is a corollary of this. I'm not calling it its own proposition. I'm calling it ground truth. And that is that when in fact you see text that is anchored in real testimonials, firsthand information, things of that nature, it's far more likely that it is anchored in what might be called ground truth. And that is, it's borrowed from meteorology, and now data scientists use this quite a bit, where it's kind of, I'm anchoring this in personal observation, not in some other digital format, right? So the fallacy I'm saying here, the fallacy of digital ground truth exists. And that is that if my only check on what's real is another digital document or a digital source, well, what we're doing is we're going in circles, right? So this whole idea about digital fact checkers and things of that nature, my personal preference is not to use them, because unless they can actually see something firsthand, I tend to say, well, I'm in this kind of loop, okay? So that's just kind of it's a term to be aware of, ground truth. It's now, data scientists use this more and more in machine learning, and it's really dealing to the data itself, right? The reliability and validity of the source of the data you use. Okay. Hopefully I'm operating at a pace that's not too fast, not too slow. If we'll have a discussion, when I'm done here. Proposition 5, under conditions of censorship, detecting what is not being said can be just as important as what is being said. Likelihood ratios in machine learning predictive modeling can uncover linguistic nuances used in deception. So here's where we get into this, what I consider the ultimate test, kind of from my own personal self, was, can I detect certain linguistic nuances? And I came up with this idea that I wanted to take a area where I had a lot of data, which, as you know, is dealing with all sorts of things related to COVID, and I wanted a current topic. So I went and did and keep up every day. I run my models, my topic models, and so on, and I look at what's leading, what's rising, what's falling, and so on. And COVID, the vaccine is still relevant out there. So I felt that it wouldn't be too much of a stretch to kind of continue along the lines I'm doing. And now since last year, since I gave this webinar last December in 2021, there's been much more, I'll say, vociferous conversation about the effects of vaccination. And again, I'm not promoting one side or another. It's just this idea that essentially you've got the official site, basically the CDC, disagreeing with people that say there's not sufficient evidence to say that the vaccine is harmful. You've got other people. So this person, Ed Dowd, who's got on social media quite a bit about talking about excess deaths and things like this. I tend to equate the argument very much like tobacco. Now, some of you may not be old enough to remember the days of tobacco, where you had all the presidents of the big tobacco companies saying, "Look, you cannot prove cause and effect here, right? Statistically, and you can't, right? It's very, very hard to try and do that. But if you're looking at just vigilance of decision making, it doesn't matter, because once you see probabilities of either side being greater than zero, that causes you to go to the next level of searching for information. So I don't, I look basically saying, here's the CDC saying, all right, it's pretty much solid. You can take it. It's not a problem. This is fairly recent. And then you've got other people saying, look, there's excess deaths going on here. You've got the government, the Federal Reserve, showing the increase in disabilities. You've got the VAERS database talking about deaths because of all these kinds of things. About these kinds of things, and excess death from insurance companies. So again, am I taking a side? No, I'm not. I'm saying that each side has a probability greater than zero. You need to look at all sides of something. And when you do that, that is likely to lead you more towards a vigilant type of form of a decision. And so what happens, though, is when you look at both sides, and in particular, if you look at the side that says, well, the vaccines are dangerous, and you look at that group, then you see variation. You see the use of euphemisms potentially. And what a euphemism is, and again, this is dealing really mainly with the people that would say it's dangerous, but you have degrees of people saying it's dangerous. And so a euphemism, and this can apply to anything. It could be applied to elections. It could apply to technology. Some people are talking about this 5G microwave kind of thing. It can apply to anything, right? Basically, you'll see some people saying, using euphemisms, a mild or indirect word or expression is substituted for one considered to be too harsh or blunt when referring to something unpleasant or embarrassing. So the question is, do you want raw truth or unfettered truth, or do you want things downplayed, right? And when you look at the literature on linguistics, this one from Kate Burridge was very interesting. She categorized euphemisms, and this is one where she said, there is a sense in which all euphemisms are dishonest. No euphemism says how it is in a given context. Something tabooed can be acceptably spoken of as a euphemism, but not using a direct term. However, euphemistic vocabulary of language varieties such as military, political, and medical jargons add additional dimensions of guile and secrecy to disguise. Here, euphemism is used not so much to conceal offense, but to deliberately disguise a topic and to deceive. This is the sort of doublespeak that turns death into substantive negative patient care outcomes, a diagnostic misadventure of the highest magnitude, or a terminal episode, dying into terminal living and killing into unlawful or arbitrary deprivation of life. So you kind of get this, the feel of this. And again, you could view this on almost any dimension in our world that's reported on in media. And what I did was I kind of said, okay, that's very, very close to what might be called equivocate or equivocation, to speak in a way that is intentionally not clear and confusing to other people, especially to hide the truth. Okay, so how can I show an example of this given the data set that I had? Well, I have a lot of information and had it and updated a bit of it since last year on COVID, and in particular, the vaccines. And so I took two different social media channels that might be called frontline people on these channels. And I basically used WordStat to basically, one, did they speak about COVID injections? Yes or no? And you can see the counts here. And then I basically built filters in dictionaries to look at the degree that they felt that these were not good things, right? And so I'll call channel 1 the channel where the person indicated or the people indicated serious or fatal outcomes from this, that it was tied to corruption, malfeasance, recklessness, and negligence, but really also tied to a natural societal process. And then questionable effectiveness or risk benefit, and then a couple of mentions on criminal murder or depopulation. Now, on the other hand, the other extreme is what I'll call social media 2, that also spoke about these injections and talked about criminal murder or depopulation the most, right? So that's one. Now, this particular one was admitted in self-censorship. This particular, that's why I chose this. The person admitted bluntly, wasn't saying it like believed it was. This one said they were. Now, you're going to see certain problems with this channel too. I'll show you in a bit as we build a more general model, but for this particular item on what this injection will do to you, it started out much more serious, actually accusing of murder or depopulation, and then it went down from there. Now, what to do, how to handle something like this as a data scientist or a text analyst kind of person? Well, we have a theory. We have Kate Burridge's theory. We have one channel that is speaking about equivocation, admittedly. We have another that is saying that it's unrestrained. Well, how can we use this? And then we can build a model, but then we can take other channels and compare them and see which camp they tend to be more. And that's more with likelihood ratios or with machine learning. And I'm going to show you a little bit of both. And then once we're satisfied we've got something, then we can say deploy this and say we have a useful model. Okay, so what we did, now I've got my I don't know if I'm blocking. I better move this down. Okay, I'm going to move it over here. I don't know if it's blocking you or not, but basically what we do is we take probability distributions, and here I am using what is called a categorical distribution of modal mentions. And essentially it's here, I've got 63.15, I've got these items here versus this here. You can see how it's a skewed distribution. And then I go in and I take my daily posts that I have here, I run these, I built out now using the likelihood ratio method. I took them each day, which topic did they hit the most? And I basically categorized it that way. And then from there, I ran a weight of evidence score, right, to look at the plausibility of this. This is using Turing's method, Alan Turing's method that he used during the war. And that's what we did last time. And so what it led to was this. I said, okay, I've got two. I've got channel 1 and I've got channel 2. And now I'm introducing a channel 3 to test what do they say? Are they on one side or another? A purely unbiased or non-feeling one would be a straight line across the yellow here. But this one is clearly showing a red region. It tends to be equivocating. This one was here. Looking at all the daily posts and accumulating this evidence using a Bayesian measure. If it's greater than 20 dB, that's a decisive measure based on that. On the other hand, I took a channel 4 where it gave just the opposite result. Okay, so what that means is that we can build models based on references. One is a reference of what good is or true, we think. One is what is probably equivocating or using euphemisms. And then we can take a third channel and compare it to that. Now that is using likelihood ratios. But what we can do is do the same thing with machine learning, which is a much more modern method, where what we do is we take the WordStat output. Basically, I've got all the files in here, daily files. I've got the number of mentions on a number of items here that are topics. And I have separated channel 1 from channel 2, and that becomes my delimiter. So I take from that. Now here's how it looks in WordStat itself using the WordStat machine learning naive Bayes. You see it does a good job of giving you saying what the stronger predictors are towards certain channels, channel 1 or channel 2. But the reason why I went beyond this was because I wanted to reduce this to the fewest possible number of phrases. And so what I did is I put this into Minitab using its TreeNet, and I came up with a good predictive model that distinguished between them. I came up with like 7 key phrases or terms that distinguished between one who equivocates and uses euphemisms versus one who does not equivocate and use euphemisms. And you can see here that using the term jab instead of the term vaccine, they have opposite effects, right? One is a predictor, one is not. You also have others, one that use the word murder and things of that nature. So what happens is, now all this comes from the use of TreeNet out of Minitab. So what that means is now that we can then take another channel or some other post or a social media or a browser, put that through WordStat, and then take a look at the number of mentions or the words per 10K across those key predictor variables. And then we can classify something as either being censored or equivocating versus not on any record we want, right? And so what you see in this case here, it showed up that for this particular one, this is a new channel 6. Well, 135 of them showed censorship, 69 not. So we would conclude that it's probably censoring. And you kind of have a threshold there, okay? So now, if we move on, and hopefully I'm not going too fast, it's it's at 47, we're approaching the top of the hour. If we then add other dimensions besides euphemisms, right, or equivocation to the general model we have, then we can add things such as correlation with CDC. Well, I see channel 1 is highly correlated in terms of the number of mentions per 10K versus the other ones that I've looked at here, right? Also, I can look at use of obscure words. Remember, equivocation involves deception by not being clear. Well, if I look at obscure words, now there's a dictionary for obscure words. If you're not familiar with it, it's called this one here, Phonistry Info. So I can take these words and I can download these and build a WordStat dictionary out of this, and it becomes a variable, okay? What I can also do is, from last week, we talked about what Mike Flynn came up and was polarizing. Actually, Chomsky did too. My problem with this is that my reference channel 2 is also polarizing. So might be reliable for recommendation and not equivocating on the recommendation of the vax versus this one. But wait a minute, this one is showing signs of problems on its own, okay? So I'm seeing polarizing. So you see, we're having multiple dimensions of deception. Propaganda is important, not just one, because all of a sudden you start to see, well, maybe this channel 2 is not a reliable source. That's not good, okay? Now, if I also add in what I call, I observed in one, just by happenstance, I was observing these medical discussions. All of a sudden, they start introducing things about the Ukrainian-Russian war. And they became, now again, I have no stake in the war, but I know when they have spent a lot of time and a lot of text talking about the Ukrainian-Russian war, and it's all against the Ukrainians, it's what are they doing? Why are they doing that? So all of a sudden, I start to see that my level of trust is a little bit different. I'm looking across multiple dimensions. Maybe I shouldn't be using channel 2 as my reference source here, because it may be what I might think is a good source versus a equivocator on one, but on other dimensions, it's not quite so good. So I came up with this notion of trust that is, now I'm going to kind of have to move this to the side again here. There we go. Where I said, look, it's not just, do I care about one dimension? It's overall trust. And I can then build a machine learning model on high trust, low trust, or medium trust. And then I can rate anybody else into this category. So we have that. Now, my partner and I, Dale, have built, and I'll show you, essentially, we have deployed this trust model. It involves both WordStat and Minitab to make this thing operational. And so essentially what we did is we deployed this. You end up with the export of WordStat. This can be both for training the model, but also for evaluating other sources. So what happens is if I have it asks me for the words, either number of mentions, however I set it up, or the words per 10,000 that comes out of WordStat, I can enter these in here, and then it gives me a prediction. So what I might have here, I tell you what, I built a whole thing and I lost it because of Zoom. I don't want to be searching through my web on this because I'll be wasting your time. But the what I have is we have deployed different machine learning. This is called ModelOps. It's a Minitab product that takes a machine learning and be able to deploy it to your own websites. So it's conceivable, and I do know that Provalis has one as well, where you can deploy it out there using naive Bayes. And I put one together with the smallest number of possible words to come up with trust. And this one did. And you can see the output of this is that for this particular one that I input, I ended up with a prediction of high trust. Idea of vigilant decision making. Proposition 6. Kind of get through this, and this is where I kind of want to get into framing. So I'm kind of blending now into the discussion part of last week, where we talked about these aspects of framing. And Dev was kind enough to send me some of his papers. I actually learned, I think, quite a bit about this, and maybe we can even talk a little bit more about this as I finish this. But this idea of framing and using time series. So what you find is if I throw in another psychological model called a behavioral intention, what happens is that the propagandists can affect beliefs, behavioral beliefs about, for instance, is smoking good for me or not? Does smoking bother my spouse or other people who are important to me? And do I have actual control over the situation? And these things, this information tends to go through beliefs, it turns into attitudes and norms and perceptions. And then we intend to do something and we actually do it, right? So it could be whatever the targeted behavior is that the propaganda wants us to do. It's affected by this information we're receiving. It's another way of looking at Janus and Mann. And so, as we kind of saw this happen with the vaccination, you could see how information played a role in terms of steering us one way or another. And if we continued to look, we go into vigilance. If we kind of did where we were directed, we go out. Well, this can apply to anything. And when it comes to framing, it's maybe one of the best ways of doing this is to describe it. Preemptive framing allows you to set the focus of others about what they should focus on before they look at the picture. And this example is like Joe Biden. This was what Trump, how he kind of labeled people in advance. Joe Biden, another low IQ individual. You having a good time, Joe? Bernie Sanders, crazy Bernie. Elizabeth Warren, Pocahontas, Pete Buttigieg, Buttigieg, that kind of a thing. So what happens is when you hear that or hear that person again, what are you looking for? You're looking to that previous image that was put into your mind, right? And that's where this preemptive framing kind of comes in. And I think it's not just in text. You know, for instance, when you look at something like this, right, that goes on, what does that do for your confidence about whether or not you have control over your future? You know, when I get into this diagram here, this idea about perceived control, well, you don't have very much perception that you have much control at all, right? Because you'll get hit over the head with a club, that kind of a thing, right? So it's that affects you the next time, right? When we start talking about consent, that kind of a thing, it affects you in that way. So preemptive framing is a factor for that. So let me get out of this and let me move on into this. So now, when we consider potentially preemptive framing for WordStat, right? What I feel is that WordStat can play a role in this, because when you do topic modeling, so for instance, as I mentioned, I look at daily topics coming in on the news every day. I scan them in. I have a balanced sample of left, middle, right-leaning publications, and I look at titles. So I look at these and I do topic modeling on these. So for instance, if I look at election reporting in time series, and then I get that, and then the next day I look at Sam Bankman's slush fund, you see the timing there? Is it possible that the preemptive input of election reporting then timed to this, right? That's one example. Another is inflation and election fraud. So here, these two kind of coincide together, right? And you see election fraud being reported very, very low after a certain point, after like 11/17, okay? You see that? Another is election reporting and vaccine injuries, right? Is there this cross correlation time-wise on these? So this gives you a potential to do this kind of framing, you know, mass shootings. Well, here's one on mass shootings at this point in time. Well, that was exactly, you know, first came the gun violence reporting, and then following that was mass shootings, right? So that's the kind of thing that potentially text mining can help with preemptive framing as far as my thoughts are concerned. Okay, so let's see. I think, Tony, I think I've taken it to just about the top of the hour.
Yep, we're 2 minutes. So, oh, we already have a comment. Not a
Okay.
question though. Thanks
All right.
once again. Super interesting. Thank you for sharing. Thank you, Grant. Well, if you have a question, please use the chat feature, and it appears on the right-hand side of your screen. So please use the chat feature and ask a question to John, and we'll take the questions that you've got. One already, John.
Yeah.
How can we differentiate propaganda from scientific consensus if they are correlated with search results? For example, the Earth is round, or, well, I think we would all agree that scientists would agree with the Earth is round. I guess most scientists would agree that climate change is a thing. So how do we differentiate those?
Well, what I would say is it goes back to this slide right here. And that is that if you rely just on one style or source of information, you're probably more apt to get just a single viewpoint than if you had a diverse set of information. So my answer to that is keep searching till you start to run into people that disagree, and then evaluate those and consider each of those as having probabilities greater than 0. And do that. So that is how I distinguish it. I think that's an excellent question. And I think it ties into so many aspects of this. It ties into vigilant decision-making by continually searching, right? And evaluating probabilities. So a lot of this gets into how you deal probabilistically with things. And it does require searching for relevant information, challenging initial choices, and having an open mind, and not just listening. You know, groupthink that was coined by Herb Janis of Janis and Mann. is a very, very powerful problem to deal with. And it starts with your own self, of challenging yourself and continually searching for information that kind of goes outside the group. And that's, I mean, structure of scientific revolution happens that way. It really does. So that would be my answer, Tony.
Okay. But answer to a question, yes, there'll be this is being recorded, this session, and it'll be posted probably within the next week or so on the webinar section of the Provalis Research website. You can also contact John if you're interested in the slides.
Yeah, I give slides out. I'll send you the slides.
Okay. You can contact John if you have his email address. The other thing is you can contact me and I can put you in touch with John. You should all have my email address because that's how you received the link to this call. My email address should be on that. Another question, and it's sort of a more general question, but when COVID didn't exist prior to 2019, let's say, and the verbiage around COVID didn't exist before then. So it was created, and a lot of it was created by the CDC and groups like groups like that. So how do you differentiate between propaganda and information or the narrative that is being developed by a reputable organization like the CDC? Does that make sense?
Absolutely, it does. And I think it's a question. Well, I mean, I went through the same problem, right? I started out absolutely using their data. I mean, I staked my consulting reputation on some of this in terms of the recommendations I gave. And so I always view that it was kind of gospel, and also trained as an economist, right? Dealing with Federal Reserve time series data and that kind of thing. And my response to that really is that never consider anything the single source of truth, that always try to evaluate the pros and cons of everything. And that is Karl Popper in a nutshell, and that is science in a nutshell. Looking for both the pros and cons of anything, and not necessarily paying attention to what you hear on the television, not necessarily hearing what you hear from politicians, but also not necessarily hearing what you hear from objectors, people that object to things, that have their own agendas. And that is, you have to evaluate all these and look at probabilities. And that's why I use things like Bayesian belief networks, where what I do is I'll kind of lay these things out, and I'll look at assertions that people are saying pros and cons, and I try to evaluate these things in some form of ground truth, where I have firsthand accounts or I have firsthand information of tests. And when people start equivocating, or they're not coming through with providing information to answer questions, that's a signal for me. So what I have learned personally, without taking sides, is that I don't use anyone as a single source of truth on anything, and I try to always include firsthand information when I evaluate it, and I try to spot these signals of deception, because if I see a signal of deception of some type, then I know that I have I have to keep on looking, right? And that's kind of how I do it.
Okay, thank you. In what situations do you prefer to use rates, say per 1,000 words, per 10,000 words, per 100,000 words, or whatever you choose? Does it make a difference?
Yes, it does. It's a great question. When in fact you have people that use very few words in their posts versus those that have many words, or if you have people that have had posts for years and some people that are just rarely recent, it's hard to take an aggregate number of just looking at frequency. That's where the rate, say per 10,000, becomes an invaluable metric that's in WordStat. And so I do both. It's always based on kind of if I have a constant sample size, I like to use the number of mentions. But if I have this case where I could have difference in intensity of how many words, are in a certain post and it goes across, then I tend to normalize it using words per 10K.
Okay. I'm not sure if you talked about this, if you've answered this already, but would it be a fair statement that most of the internet fact checkers play along with the propaganda objectives rather than the actual truth?
Well, what I would say is I don't pay attention to fact checkers because it's all internal to the internet. I feel that fact checkers could be biased either way. I think that probably mostly they have been towards the government side of things, but I don't know for sure. But I don't pay attention to them because it's all this internal digital ground truth, right? When it's digital ground truth, then I don't believe it. If it is a ground truth that is referencing a external study of some type, and there's both pros and cons mentioned in this, right? And I can look where scientists argue with each other all the time. That's true science. When it's anchored in that, then if it's a fact checker that references that, then I'd say, okay, fine. It's not necessarily a fact checker per se, it's a scientist that is presenting a view that is different than someone else. Then I would tend to rely on it.
Okay, thank you. Rather than taking a phrase, would it be more robust to build a dictionary with a set of phrases? Maybe you did this, but
I do do that. I do that. I do build dictionaries with
okay.
phrases.
Would single phrases be less reliable?
I find them pretty closely related. I mean, less reliable than words, or
Yeah.
what?
Or
Well,
less reliable than sets of phrases?
I use sets of phrases typically for whatever I'm doing. I don't just go with one phrase. I typically use more than one that is related. And what happens is when you do the export of topic modeling, it includes a lot of the phrases. Now you have to weigh them and you have to evaluate which ones are useful. But I tend to use phrases. Now, in some cases, the phrases to be willing to look through all the phrases that come out. So when you do your extract, you look at those and you read through the entire list and then bring those over into the dictionary. And it can be very powerful. And so sometimes when I build dictionaries, I use single words. Sometimes I use phrases. And but I have to look at the results of the extract to do it.
Okay, does a decision tree use a limited number of phrases?
A decision tree. What I do is, all right, what I will do typically is I will take phrases and then I will aggregate them into a topic, very much like topic modeling. So typically what I'll do is I'll start with topic modeling, and then I will put as a level 2 a series of phrases underneath. Now, sometimes I'll find phrases from other sources that will go in there. Then it's from there that I do like a decision tree. It's always typically related to a topic. That's the way I normally would do it.
Okay. Thank you very much. I don't think we have any more questions. So would you have any sort of things to sum up, John? You have a final word?
No, I think the questions did it. I think next time we'll be looking at, I've got maybe a few miscellaneous items I want to hit. But this idea of computer generated text next time, I really, and not that I'm expecting or would ever want WordStat to be a tool to use computer generated text, but I view that as a very, very worrisome future with that, because people with the right resources can create a massive amount of documents out there and websites and so on when it's just a handful of people doing this. And so how you would spot that. And that's really what I want to hit next time. I think probably in terms of our objectives, I think, there's certainly a lot of deception techniques and propaganda techniques that we have not touched on. But my goal is that when you see some of these and you just read the literature on these, you can build your own models and you can build these in WordStat your own way, right? And so we've touched on some of these here. So that's kind of where I'm going. So there's probably a few more we'll do next time, but I would really like to get into this analysis of computer-generated text and how we can spot it using WordStat and some other statistical tools.
Okay. Thank you, John. We'll look forward to that. We'll schedule the third in the series for a bit later on in the spring. So please watch for your website and our news. Watch our website, our newsletter, LinkedIn, and our Twitter feed for the date and time. Plus, everybody who joined this call, you'll be receiving an email as well. We have 2 more events scheduled in March and April. As I mentioned, our next event will be March 29th, the same time, noon Eastern. It's titled No Comment Left Behind, the use of QDA Miner computer-assisted coding in large data sets. You can register on the webinar section of our website, and that's going to be presented by Lucy McIntosh. So thank you very much, John. This has been recorded. People, you can go to our website and see the recording. Like I said, it'll be posted hopefully within a week or so. So thank you very much, John. Have a great day, everybody, and we'll see you next time.
All right, everybody. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.